Death Squads. Death Squads has been one of those things where, when you talk about 1980s El Salvador, that's one of the main things that people talk about. Not just the war, but they talk about the large amount of death squads and people disappearing, and people being afraid. And it's not just confined to the 1980s. It's also confined to modern days with the rise of, or the return of death squads taking care of things like MS-13 members and the criminal organizations, even though people themselves say that the death squads are themselves criminals, others see them as a vigilante group. Other people see them as a group that stepped up when the government didn't want to, or in modern day when the corrupt police officers didn't want to deal with gang members because of how much money they were bringing into the country. Then came the death squads. They returned and started executing, gang members and criminals. And some people were afraid. Other people applauded them, saying, finally, somebody is doing something about this. But let's kind of look at where the history of the death squads in El Salvador come from. So let's travel back. Let's just get into it. We have seen that the relationship between the military and the oligarchy dated back to at least the 1930s with a sense of common interest, stopping communism and other threats to their privileged place in Salvadorian society. One explanation for the rise of death squads in the 1970s is that officers realized they did not need the oligarchy to remain in power, and at times social reforms was the military's interest, so the oligarchs created their own paramilitary forces, or death squads, closely or loosely tied to government security forces, most notably the military, often employing off-duty soldiers desperate for a second income. These death squads shared such a deep antipathy for the revolutionary left that they aggressively targeted them, starting in the late 1970s. The CIA reported in 1985 that death squads were in fact a function of the small, and I quote, extreme right versus the, and using air quotes again, mainstream right. Both camps were nationalist and anti-communist, but only the extremists were characterized by a willingness to confront that change with active subversion of the constitutional system and with violent terrorism. Interestingly, the CIA explained to U.S. officials that the extreme right did not predominate in any one social, economic, or political sector. Rather, it is a fanatic fringe drawn from all elements of society. This can be explained by the fact that while few Salvadorians were active in death squads, many more from all economic classes, including rural peasantry, quietly condoned their behavior, since they thought it was working against the revolutionary left. So I'm quoting somebody here. However repugnant the method is used, end quote. Critics encounter that the real power behind the death squads was the military, not the oligarchy. The extreme right is just a convenient term for sick sort of this government unto itself. Yet it could have been the case that the military was simply the violent arm of the so-called extreme right. Some of the death squads grew out of the vigilante groups used to squash dissent of the countryside. Some of these, like the infamous Orden, were officially sanctioned national organizations. Others were more and ad hoc and localized. As we have seen, these groups believed that killing and threatening suspected subversives would take care of the communist threats, as pointed out by the conservative political Alberto Bondanza, who helped found a conservative National Republic Alliance, or Alianza Republicana Nacionalista, ARENA, out of rightist paramilitary groups. If the Americans think that this is a war of one army against another, they are mistaken. This is not a conventional war. The only form of fighting is the form that they, the left, implement. Once you identify your enemy, you will probably die. Fortunately, the military is with us. For those that are fighting are the death squads. Given that they were operating under many different labels, another difficult question to answer was the size and number of death squad leaders. One U.S. official contended that the individuals use so many varied labels as a way of pretending of trying to present an image that they are large as they are many, yet he believed it is the same people using different names. We have estimate to put it in numbers. At first we thought there were about 100, but the truth is, I would say that there are not more than 25. Even of these numbers, maybe 5 were leaders. The rest are often off-duty soldiers. The dilemma U.S. officials faced in the role to save El Salvador from communism in these early years was supporting the official government and security forces that they had a tacit and even direct involvement in death squad activity. So one question is whether the United States was guilty by association. Did the robust American assistance and advice make the death squad situation better or worse? Another problem was that the death squad's lethality against the guerrilla cells in the cities was making the left more convinced that the national war was the only way to effect revolution, something that would immeasurably complicate Washington's ability to draw the line against communism in El Salvador. Similar to what was occurring in Guatemala at the same time, by the late 1970s, death squads adopted chilling names such as the White Warriors Union or the Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez Brigade in an effort to sow terror amongst the population, especially the students and urban workers who were most likely to be sympathetic to the guerrilla cause. Priests advocating to the radical tenets of liberation theology were also routine targets. With their ranks often consistent of military conscripts or retired officers, the operatives were privately paid by shadowy death squad sponsors around $40 per month, and sometimes even given life insurance. According to a civilian member of the Christian Democratic Junta, the death squads usually included poorly educated non-commissioned officers. Sergeants, for example, were one of the main people that they used. So, uneducated people in the military that were very gung-ho was their main target for recruitment. So when they kill unarmed civilians, they really think they are killing communists. The funding sources were often murky. Businessmen eager to check the communist subversion were one likely group. Related wealthy Salvadoran families living in Miami or Guatemala City were some major financial backers, although their personal involvement in death squad organizing and administering is not clear. The death squads made public pronouncements championing their anti-communist cause and denouncing enemies. In 1975, note from an emerging death squad called Anti-Communist Liberation Armed Forces, Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Anticomunista, Guerra de Eliminación, read, and I quote, "We will have the advantage of acting outside the law, just like the communists. This is the only way to destroy the communist beast. We will support the security forces by killing the judges, the law clerks, or corrupt lawyers that want to prosecute them for the deaths of communists or useful fools. The people must understand that this organization will act outside the limits of the law, for the good of the population itself and for its freedom." End quote. In 1980, the Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez Brigade printed the Comunique from a death squad in the San Salvador newspaper El Diario de Hoy. And I quote, "The brigade calls on the national conscience not to be intimidated by the false prophets who say nothing when communists destroy businesses, burn coffee sheds, kill peasants, and cruelly assassinate military personnel, security agents, and soldiers, but react profusely when communists are executed. The leaders of the Catholic Church said nothing when South African Ambassador Dunn was killed, when the progressive industrialists were kidnapped, or when peasants were massacred in San Pedro Perloapan and San Esteban Catarina, where the communists had imposed their will by force. In those cases, there was no clamor for respect for human rights, nor was there any cry of injustice. In those cases, no defenders were forthcoming from those humble sons of the people. However, the church leaders come out in defense of human rights. That is hypocrisy." End quote. As the death squad activity continued at its relentless pace in 1980, the State Department appointed a new ambassador in San Salvador, the veteran diplomat Robert White. White had been ambassador to Paraguay, where he staunchly advocated civil liberties and clashed with strongman Alfredo Stroessner. Given his reputation, White's selection reinforced the Carter's administration emphasis on human rights in El Salvador and Central America. White quickly got to work. In a speech to the Salvadorian American Chamber of Commerce in late March, he suggested that businesses were funding the death squads. This prompted one landowner to comment. Next, the USA will just send in the Marines to kill anyone in a three-piece suit. Another lamented, now we are made to fear the Yankees as much as the communists. We thought the USA would defend free enterprise. Rightist protesters were even known to dismissively chant, white is red. The death squads were, of course, harrowing social phenomenon in El Salvador. The international attention they garnered also proved salient for U.S. policy, since many Americans skeptical of U.S. efforts abroad connected to the gruesome activities by death squads to the U.S. military assistance. Here is how one correspondent in the 1980s portrayed the setting of a violent evening in El Salvador for readers. The popping sounds would usually start at night. Foreign guests staying at San Salvador's luxury hotel might think that they were hearing the hollow explosions of firecrackers off in the distance. But there were no firecrackers. These were the sounds of gunfire, as the escuadrondelamuerte, death squads, made their chilling nightly rounds, looking for suspected subversives or anyone else who might be on their hit list. End quote. The FPL commander, Garpio, recounted in December 1980s, disfigured bodies began to appear with signs that read, "Merry Christmas, people! We are ridding you of terrorists." These are the sorts of images and languages that are inextricably tied to our memory of El Salvador during the internal war. Journalist Mark Donner described the gruesome scenes in the early years of violence. Sometimes the body were headless or faceless, their features having been obliterated with a shotgun blast or an application of battery acid. Sometimes limbs were missing, or hands or feet chopped off, or eyes gouged out. Women's genitals were torn and bloody. Bespeaking repeated rape, men's were often found severed and stuffed into their mouths and cut into flesh of a corpse back or chest was likely to be the signature of one another's death. What that is? Who wrote this? Sorry, I'm trying to read this quote here, and it seems there's a lot of typos, probably because it's somebody whose English wasn't their first language. Let me see if I can kind of make sense of this. Let me start over. Sometimes the bodies were headless or faceless, their features having been obliterated with a shotgun blast or an application of battery acid. Sometimes limbs were missing, or hands or feet chopped off, or eyes gouged out. Women's genitals were torn and bloody. Bespeaking repeated rape. Men's were often found severed and stuffed into their mouths, I'm assuming their genitals, and cut into the flesh of a corpse's back or chest was likely to be the signature of one another of the death squads that had done the work. That's still confusing, but much better. Death squad activity became so common and lethal that one foreign correspondent concluded, for an outsider, even one conditioned over a decade to the standard savageries of Asian wars and African rebellions, El Salvador is a nightmare beyond comprehension. Another analysis by the award-winning 1983 article from the Albuquerque Journal exposed the origin of the death squads. In recent years, the United States had allied itself with some of the darkest forces in El Salvador, but the worst had been tolerance of clandestine terror driven by the powerful Salvadoran oligarchy. As we have seen, the officers' reformist coup of 1979 shocked El Salvador's repressive political, economic, and social structures. If there were particular political losers in the aftermath of the coup, it was the oligarchy. While still powerful, it no longer held an iron grip on the country's economy. Yet there was also an element of hardline military officers who stood to lose in the new junta-led era. These Salvadoran military officers were considered the junta to be infiltrated by Marxist officers, which could be fatal for the independence and freedom of the Salvadoran fatherland if the anti-communists in the population fail to act. One way these elements would fight back was through pressuring the junta or jettison leftist members. Another method was death squad violence that targeted relatively modern Christian Democrats that had embraced the junta. The intellectual and operational head of this informal anti-junta officer network And this is a guy that appears through all of the history books. You know, if you type in this guy's name, you're going to get a long rap sheet. So let's try to keep it short here. Okay. Network was former Major Roberto Davidson Arrieta. Davidson was born on August 23, 1943, in Santa Tecla, a large town close to San Salvador. He was the son of Roberto Davidson Andrade, a salesman, and Joaquina Arrieta Alvarado Davidson, a career civil servant. The family's paternal roots were French, a legacy that began in El Salvador in the 19th century. One of its forebears was a Frenchman who worked for the Lesseps Company in its failed quest to build a canal across the Isthmus. The young Davidson studied at the Salvadoran Military Academy and later served in Arrieta's National Guard as an intelligence officer. Davidson was also protege of Alberto Medrano, former CIA liaison and architect of the paramilitary outfit Orden and the state's intelligence agency. Medrano affectionately referred to Davidson and two other young officers as my three assassins. As a budding officer, Davidson studies intelligence and security in various American military schools and took a communications course at the U.S. Army School of the Americas. He also observed police orientations in Uruguay and Taiwan, two military-ruled countries, and trained with the U.S. Special Forces in Panama. One recurring question is whether U.S. training was instrumental in turning Davidson into such a maniacal anti-communist killer. In the mid-1970s, Davidson is known as Chele, which is a slang term in El Salvador, which means light-skinned or pale, directed the White Warriors Union, one of the most notorious of the first wave of death squads. Then a major, he was dismissed from the military following the reformist in October 1979 coup. While no longer on the inside of the government's intelligence apparatus and funding, Davidson's fiery charisma allowed him to draw sizable financial support from the country's oligarchy, who feared their economic interests were threatened by the junta's expansive reform policies. Shortly after Archbishop Oscar Romero's murder in March 1980, Davidson's U.S. visa was revoked due to his death squad activities. Nevertheless, Davidson managed to slip into the United States to meet with conservative allies, including the American Legion and some congressional Republicans. In a secret cable, the U.S. Embassy reported that Davidson even bragged that his political party was in direct contact with Republican legislators in Congress. Returning to El Salvador, Davidson also tapped an unbeat message for his supporters in the Salvadoran military. I quote, "We have spoken with various senators in the capital, and they asked us that we maintain until November. The Reagan Republicans will win, and our luck will change." Davidson also shitted U.S. diplomats for pursuing a native policy. What was that? Anyways, engaging the Duarte-led junta that would lead to a communist takeover in El Salvador. For what was needed was an iron fist approach that would stamp out the subversive threat once and for all. 1 month after his visit to the United States, while most of the country was mourning Archbishop Romero's death, Davidson made a speech distributed on video cassette celebrating the assassination. Shortly before his murder, Romero had publicly denounced Davidson as a liar, torturer, and murderer. In a taped speech, Davidson made an effort to delegitimize the reformist government that he despised, and accusing moderate governing junta members of subversion. The civilian Jose Antonio Morales Ehrlich of having links to the guerrillas. In fact, Ehrlich's son was a member, and Colonel Adolfo Majano of being a member of the Mexican Communist Party. After attempting his own coup against the government junta in May 1980, Davidson was arrested along with other implemented officers and civilians and accused of conspiracy, but he was released by a military judge. Before his release, though, wealthy families gathered outside the U.S. ambassador's residency calling for Davidson's release, chanting, "Viva Reagan!" and "Viva Jesse Helms!" Upon his release, Davidson held a news conference where he repeated his charges against the juntas Majano and Morales Ehrlich before departing to a boisterous and temporary exile in Guatemala. A few days after Davidson's arrest for an attempted coup in May 1980 against the ruling junta, it is Likely not coincidental that 7 of the most notorious death squads in the countryside declared their unification under the title Salvadorian Anti-Communist Army, Ejército Salvadoreño Anticomunista, or ESA. The proclamation also urged rightist political groups to unite the death squads with the military. Over the next several months, death squad activity would reach its most ferocious pace, around 1,000 killings per month. In the history of this clandestine quasi-official war against Marxist subversion, one Salvadorian politician analyst put the surge in killing in perspective. It is one thing for the death squads to go after several hundred peasants in a decade, as it was the case in the 1950s and 60s. It is another thing to kill more than 12,000 people in 1 year, as it happened in 1981. In subsequent years, Daubison, the godfather of the politics of hate, as journalist James Lemoyne called him, continued to simultaneously conduct both death squad work and politics. Daubison was well trained and perfectly placed to provide the link between the Salvadorian oligarchy and the shadowy network of security forces and intelligence services. To his supporters, he was simply the single most effective leader to prevent a left-wing takeover of El Salvador, an outcome that many of the oligarchy found unacceptable. As for Daubison, the method of choice was the illegal use of force. Indeed, in his view, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth was needed to root out the communist scourge. During his brief exile in Guatemala following his arrest for the failed coup in 1980, Daubison made contacts with the internationally linked anti-communist network and individual anti-communists. From his perch in Guatemala, Daubison also continued to plan a direct numerous death squads attacks in El Salvador. On his return, his native country, he maintained access to the source that kept him permanently supplied with abundant, up-to-date intelligence information from most armed units or territorial districts, and found other leaders who shared his political views. They offered him logistical support for his activities, sending troops for his personal protection, and supplying weapons. The former major routinely appeared on rightist television programs to castigate the governing junta and other political opponents. In August 1981, Daubison openly promoted the need to kill 200,000 to 300,000 people to restore peace in El Salvador. Daubison boasted about the National Agency of Special Services of El Salvador, Agencia Nacional de Seguridad Salvadoreña, ANESAL, the intelligence agency that he led before it was disbanded after a reformist coup. ANESAL had served as an umbrella civil organization to back the security forces politically and maintain military intelligence capacities. Following the coup, Daubison founded the National Broad Front, Frente Amplio Nacional, a civil organization that consisted of private business outfits such as coffee growers, cattle ranchers, and young executives. It also included women and youth organizations, all elements that would later form part of the rightist political party led by Daubison. What lurked beneath the more visible fan, so for those of you that were not paying attention, FAN stands for Frente Amplio Nacional, was an underground network of civilian military death squads. Some of these adherents might have sworn a blood oath, dedicating their soul to the struggle against communism. Ricardo Paredes, a founding leader of the FAN, described its mandate as being counterparts to the army, giving it information about persons ranging from the peasant to the very high-up people. To help defeat the guerrillas, it is not a civil war, an open war, a legal war. We don't want to fight a fair war. We have to go and beat their pants off. He continued, if you destroy the civilian organization, the guerrillas will starve up in the mountains. Or as Daubison explained, because the ultimate leadership of the communist organization is always hidden, the intelligence services must be turned into services of combat to undercover the secret brain and destroy it. One point made by many observers is that the dirty little secret shared by those committed to preventing an FMLN victory, which included both the Salvadoran security forces and Washington, was that the death squads worked. That is, the scale of killing annihilated the left, especially in the urban areas, so that by, say, the 1981 final offensive, the guerrillas in fact never had a realistic chance of taking power. This interpretation is used to explain why death squad's activity dropped so immensely by the mid-1980s, there was simply no one else to kill. Think about that quote. Robert White, the American ambassador from 1980 to 1981, famously said that Mr. Daubison had a sick mind and was a pathological killer. Over the 1980s, the unapologetic anti-communists, they vehemently organized death squads and contended that his accusers were communists or puppets of the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. It is ironic that Daubison will come up to despise the CIA, given that both were stridently anti-communist. This might also reveal that the Salvadorian right was closer to, say, Jesse Helms' ideology than that of the CIA's, despite the embarrassment of Carter and Reagan's administration's official. Daubison remained a hero to the U.S. far right. In December 1984, roughly a dozen conservative organizations honored Daubison in Washington with a plaque and dinner attended by 120 guests at Capitol Hill Club. The plaque expressed appreciation for Daubison's continuing efforts for freedom in the face of communist aggression, which is an exploration of freedom and loving people everywhere. In late 1981, as elections for the new provisional government were shaping up, the rightist political party, Arena, was created, led by Daubison, and committed to opposing the ruling junta led by Christian Democratic José Napoleón Duarte. Apparently 2 years before the late 1981 founding, a meeting took place in the Tony headquarters of Guatemala's ultra-right-wing National Liberation Front, Movimiento de Liberación Nacional, in Guatemala City, a political outfit founded by Mario Sandoval Alarcón. Originally established in the 1950s as a paramilitary group, the MLN only later turned into a political party. Sandoval told his audience that young Salvadorian businessmen, concerned about the leftist direction of their country, was adopting under the reformist military-civilian junta that they would have to make enormous sacrifices in order to establish the equivalent of the MLN in their country. Sandoval advised to the nascent Arena, and many have even loaned his advisors to train his Salvadorian counterparts in clandestine counter-subversion techniques. Sandoval claimed that he gave the MLN slogan, Dios, Patria y Libertad, God, Fatherland, and Liberty, to Arena. The core ideology of Arena's adherents was a fervent blend of anti-communism, laissez-faire capitalism, and patriotism. I remember as a kid, I had family members that were deeply involved with the Arena group. They even had their own little national anthem. Let me see if I remember it. Alianza Republicana Nacionalista, something like that. And then Patria sí, comunista no. Patria sí, comunista no. He's saying, patriotism yes, communism no. Patriotism yes, communism no. Anyways, so let's continue. I got sidetracked there. Okay. All right, let's quote here. And I quote, "They believe in Jeffersonian democracy and death squads. Their colors are red, white, and blue. They are strident Salvadorian nationalists who have built the country's second largest party from a violent anti-communist network and the perfect English they learned in American schools. They defend the killing of thousands of civilians necessary to preserve democracy and the free market. In short, they are fighting for what Americans cherish most with the methods Americans value least." End quote. In perhaps a different interpretation of the rightist party's birth, the Los Angeles Times reported that separate from Guatemalan influence, Daubison's motives for founding Arena might have first hatched at a Washington dinner party in March 1981, attended by one of the retired officer's closest associates. 16 conservative operatives attended the dinner, including aides to Senator Jesse Helms. These individuals might have encouraged their Salvadorian counterparts to establish their own political party. When Arena first made its appearance, the charismatic Daubison would lead rallies with Arena's song, "Tremble, Tremble, Communists." He would amuse supporters by slicing a watermelon with a machete. He would then tell the crowd that the watermelon was Duarte, green, the Christian Democrats' color, on an outside, but Duarte, green, the Christian Democrats, on the outside, but red on the inside. Throughout the war years, Daubison vehemently denied that he was linked to death squads. In 1983, he said that these accusations were a work orchestrated by the left, who have their own plans of disinformation abroad and its workings. All this time, Arena was a political movement that, according to the CIA, would cooperate and direct some terrorist groups. The CIA concluded that Arena's internal terrorist network was but one part of the broader Deathsquad network. The party influenced extremist perspectives that led to the illegal wanton violence. Behind Arena's legitimate exterior lay a terrorist network led by Daubison's henchmen and funded by wealthy Salvadorian expatriates residing in Guatemala and the United States. One quote here was, "The United States had come here to conduct alien experiments." By 1984, Daubison already low estimation of the U.S. government engagement policies had only continued to deteriorate. He explained his thinking was to an audience during his presidential campaign in 1984, and I quote, "As a nationalist, I want to offer this..." Should I say it in a... Let's try this again. "As a nationalist, I want to offer in this most important forum what members of Arena feel. Let us not delude ourselves regarding the situation we are experiencing. The problem that is facing El Salvador is not only that this country is a target of international communism. We are guinea pigs. The two great world powers have come here to confront each other. The United States, the defender of our freedom, has come here to carry out alien experiments without even asking us if we wanted to be part of those experiments. They are supplying the weapons and the money for this confrontation, and unfortunately, we Salvadorians are supplying the blood and the destruction of our people and of our fatherland. Based on this reality, we must respond to those two currents that are confronting each other here, and we are playing experimentation with us." Daubison on the campaign trail spoke of Arena's vehement resistance to government reforms, including land reforms. Many Salvadorians who did vote for Arena, and Daubison in particular, he served as head of El Salvador's Constituent Assembly in 1982 and 1983. Received 40% of the votes for president in 1984. Duarte won with 59%. Let's see a quote here. "I took photos of the body. Foreign journalists and other observers usually describe Death Squad's activity in graphic detail. Thus, the horrors of El Salvador were reaching a global audience. Not surprisingly, these accounts were often firsthand influenced by public opinions, most critically in the United States, given Washington's deep involvement in the conflict. In a sense, both the Death Squads and international reporting on the Death Squads were two key and overlapping phenomena in the Salvadoran saga. Terry Troya, a doctoral candidate at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, spent 6 months in 1984 traveling throughout the Central America and spoke at universities and churches in the United States upon her return. Troya described one episode where she was looking for a pastor from a Catholic parish somewhere on the outskirts of San Salvador. Nobody in El Salvador, not even the most faithful of churchgoers, will tell you the name of their pastor. Not that they don't know, it's just that handing over a name to a stranger is treason in El Salvador. Finally, after an arduous search, she found him in time for their meeting. But what she found was a distressed pastor who, with weary eyes, informed her of the death of one of our people. She took off on a search for the body with the help of a young boy selling newspapers who reluctantly told her where to go. The following excerpt describes what Troya witnessed that day, and I quote, "I followed a dirt road, house lined on one side, an empty lot with garbage on the other side. In the middle of the street, people were gathered around a station wagon. She was there in the midst of them, lying in the back of the car. Her face was calm and relaxed. Her features were like those of an indigenous people, with soft, mocha-colored skin and thick black hair pulled back. much like my own hair. She had bled from a bullet wound right above her eye, and the blood had trickled down to the side of her face. Her cotton pants had been torn from the knee down. Whether she had been macheted or machine gunned in a knee was difficult to tell. I couldn't find the knee in the midst of this sea of blood. The crowd backed away quietly as between my own heartbeats I took photos of the body. In Troya's estimation, this sort of violence further revealed the depravity of Washington's policies in El Salvador. Neither President Reagan nor the members of Congress who voted to continue this madness will ever meet her. But I met Idalia, the dead girl, in the back seat of a station wagon, and I know the truth that her death tells. We're going to stop there, guys. There's just so much content. So stay tuned for Reagan in El Salvador. So that's going to be exciting. Anyways, guys, you guys are listening to this on YouTube. Remember to like and subscribe. If you guys are listening to this on, what is that other thing called? Spotify, be sure to share it with as many people as you know if you like the show and you want to share it. Or you guys can just go on the YouTube channel and check out my dogs and all that fun stuff. That's it. And remember, guys, that if you... man, see, the thing is that I used to have another show. And that used to say, if you're listening to this, you are the resistance. But that was a different show. In this show, we say, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. So let's end it there.